The silence of Blackwood Creek. The dust tasted of forgotten life. Elias Thorne, a man more comfortable with the dead than the living, ran a gloved finger over the brittle spine of a 19th century ledger. His work as a historical genealogist was a quiet one, a profession of whispers and shadows, tracing the faint lines of ancestry through faded ink and crumbling paper. He had been commissioned by a wealthy client to map out a particularly obscure branch of their family tree, a line that had withered and died in a forgotten corner of New England, Blackwood Creek. The town itself was barely a ghost, a collapsed church steeple, a handful of stone foundations choked by ivy, and the all-important cemetery were all that remained. Be within the town's archives a damp, stone-walled room in the basement of the nearest county seat, Eslebertha, Elias found the first tremor of unease. He was cross-referencing death certificates with the personal diary of one Hezekiah Thorne, his client's Grek-Retikar, who had been the town undertaker in the 1870s. Most of Hezekiah's entries were morbidly mundane, notes on coffin linings, outstanding payments, and the stoicism of grieving families. But one entry, dated October 12th, 1876, was different. Usually so precise, was a spidery, panicked scrawl. Another, taken by the waking sickness, young Annabel Potter. Family insists on the precaution. I have fitted the casket with my latest designer breathing tube disguised as an ornamental cross, and the copper bell pull clutched in her right hand. May God have mercy on my soul if it ever rings. The silence of this valley is heavy enough without the dead demanding to be heard. Pie, I fear what lies beneath. Our soil is not rest, but a terrible waiting patience. Elias frowned. The waking sickness was likely catalepsy, a condition that could mimic death, a source of great terror in the Victorian era. The precaution he was referring to was a safety coffin, an invention for the truly paranoid. It was a fascinating, if macabre, piece of local history. He made a note to inspect the Potter family plot when he next visited the Blackwood Creek Cemetery. A week later, Elias stood among the leaning Morsiton headstones. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. He found the Potter plot easily, a small, fenced-in area with several graves. Annabel's was the smallest, its headstone a simple stone angel, now faceless from a century of acid rain. What was odd was the ground around it, while the other graves were settled and overgrown. The earth, it was subtly sunken, and a small, rusted iron cross, which he now realized must be the top of the breathing tube, poked out of the soil at a strange angle. He knelt, his historian's curiosity overriding the creeping sense of trespass. He ran his fingers over the cold, pitted iron. As he did, so subtle, he almost missed it. Scratch, scratch. It was like the sound of a mouse scratching behind a wall. He froze, listening. The wind sighed through the skeletal trees, and he told himself that's all it was, an animal born. The roots of an old tree shifting in the air. P, who's a man of logic, of documented facts. He stood up, brushed the dirt from his trousers, and forced himself to walk away, the sound echoing in his memory. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The scratching sound played on a loop in his mind. He delved back into Hezekiah's diary, his reading light a small, lonely beacon in his motel room. He found more entries about the waking sickness. It had been an epidemic of sorts in Blackwood Creek. Dozens had been buried with the precaution. Hezekiah's notes grew more frantic over the year. The bell, I heard it last night, from the Miller boy's grave. A single, muffled ting. I told myself it was a frostquake in the ground. I had to. I could not bear the alternative. I did not go. I will not go. Another entry, years later, was even more chilling. They say the ground here is cursed, that the soil itself keeps them awake. I no longer build the safety coffin. It is a crueler hope than no hope at all. Better to let them sleep, or whatever it is they do down there in the silent dark. A cold dread, heavy and physical, settled in Elias's gut. This was no longer just a historical curiosity. He felt a morbid, irresistible pullback to that lonely cemetery. He, armed with a powerful flashlight and a small trowel from his car's emergency kit, he drove back to Blackwood Creek under the cold, indifferent light of a sliver moon. The cemetery was a different entity at night. Shadows danced like specters, and every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. He walked directly to Annabel Potter's grave, his heart hammering against his ribs. P knelt again, pressing his ear to the damp ground. The silence was absolute. He felt a wave of relief, mixed with foolishness. Of course, there was nothing. P was letting the ramblings of a long-dead, superstitious undertaker get to him. Here, he was about to stand when he heard it. Not a scratching this time, a voice. It was a whisper, thin and reedy, distorted by the feet of earth between them. It was impossible to make out words, but the cadence was unmistakable, a desperate, pleading murmur. It was the sound of a story being told to no one, a prayer sent up into a ceiling of dirt and roots. Double quotes, ... please, ... Listen. Elias scrambled back, dropping his flashlight. Care. Its beam cut a wild, panicked arc across the tombstones. He was breathing in ragged gasps, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. This was impossible, utterly impossible. A human body, even an embalmed one, would be skeletal remains after 140 years. There would be no vocal cords, no breath to form words. Yet he had heard it. He thought of Hezekiah's words. The soil itself keeps them awake. The third time he went back, it was not with a trowel, but with a sturdy shovel. He didn't know what he was doing, or why. He was no longer a historian. He was an acolyte of a terrible mystery. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bloody strokes of orange and purple. He didn't want to be here after dark again. He began to dig. The work was grueling. The soil was dense and webbed with thick roots that he had to hack through. Every shovel full of earth felt like a violation, an act of sacrilege. But the whispers urged him on. They were clearer now, a soft, continuous stream of broken phrases and sorrowful moan. It was the sound of ultimate loneliness. Hours passed. His muscles screamed, and sweat plastered his hair to his forehead. Finally, his shovel struck something hard with a dull thud. Wood. Frantically, he cleared the remaining earth, his hands raw and bleeding. B. The top of a small wooden coffin was exposed. And just as Hezekiah's diary described, a thin copper wire snaked from a small hole in the lid, leading to a small, tarnished bell that now lay silently in the dirt. With trembling hands, Elias worked his fingers under the coffin lid. It was swollen with damp and held fast by rusted iron clasps. He pried at them, the screech of metal, a scream in the twilight. Hoots with a final, desperate heave. The lid gave way, releasing a gust of stale, ancient air that smelled of grave mold and something else. Something metallic and wrong. He shone his wavering flashlight into the abyss. He expected a skeleton. He was prepared for it. But what he saw shattered his sanity. The small form of Annabel Potter was there, but she was not a skeleton. Her body was desiccated, mummified by the strange properties of the soil. Push skin was like old parchment, stretched over a delicate frame of bones. Her dress had long since rotted into a brown, fibrous dust. Her fingers, worn down to the first knuckle, were still curled around the rotted remains of the belt. But that wasn't the horror. The horror was the inside of the coffin lid. It was covered from end to end in scratches. Not just fingernail scratches, but deeper gouges, as if made by a tool. And intertwined with the frantic scratches were words, crudely carved into the wood. Not I learn. It whispers. It keeps me awake. Sings the song of the dirt. Father, why did you leave me with it? It wants out. Not alone. Not asleep. Never asleep. Elias's blood ran cold. He stared at the tiny, mummified form, and a new, more profound terror washed over him. Annabel hadn't been alone in her premature grave. The waking sickness wasn't catalepsy. It was something else. Something that lived in the soil of Blackwood Creek. Something that found its way into the buried, keeping them conscious. A captive audience for its endless, subterranean whisper. Hezekiah hadn't been afraid of the buried waking up. He had been afraid of what they were buried with. As this realization crashed down on him, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound came from the coffin. Ting. His eyes shot to the small bell lying in the dirt beside the grave. It had moved. He shivered, and then, with a dry, metallic rasp, it rang. Again, tinglingly. It was sharp, clear, and coming from right beside him. The copper wire was vibrating, pulled by a force from within the now open coffin. Elias screamed, a raw, guttural sound of a mind breaking. He stumbled backward, falling into the pile of excavated earth. His gaze was locked on the coffin, where the small, mummified form of Annabel Potter seemed to be. Shifting, a dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. filled the air. The whispers were no longer coming from the ground. They were coming from her, but it wasn't her voice. Die. It was a chorus of 1,000 dry, ancient voices, all speaking at once from that single, tiny mouth. Bay found Elias Thorne 3 days later, wandering the old highway. His clothes were torn and caked in mud. He was clutching a rusty shovel in one hand and a small, tarnished copper bell in the other. He was admitted to the nearest psychiatric hospital, where he spent his remaining days in a padded room, rocking back and forth, endlessly whispering to himself. Not alone, never asleep. It sings the song of the dead. The authorities from the county seat went to the cemetery. They found the open grave and the desecrated coffin. They documented it as the work of a disturbed grave robber. They placed the mummified remains and the splintered lid back inside, filled the hole, and placed a heavy stone slab over the top to prevent further tampering. But sometimes, on cold, quiet nights, the locals in the new town, miles away from the ruins of Blackwood Creek, swear they can hear it. A faint, distant sound carried on the wind. A tiny, metallic ring. A desperate plea for silence from a place that will never, ever sleep.